Okay, everyone, so this is competition and K-debates. There's kind of three components to this that I'm trying to get through. The first two will be relatively quick. The first will be a brief overview of what makes critique debate different from other debates in terms of framework. The second is an overview of the current meta, which seems to be framework no Ks versus framework no plans. And then there will be an introduction to a premise that is a little bit different, that attempts to facilitate debates that include critiques but do not devolve into an endless game of who makes the most or fewest technical concessions. I want to start the way I start most of these lectures, which are an overview of proof and rejoinder, because those are the foundation of the activity. Burden of proof is the affirmative's burden, so the affirmative has to demonstrate that their offense is unique to the world that is most desirable, they have to be necessary. Their proposed change to the status quo is necessary for improvement, that the best policy option necessarily must include the AF. The negative, burden of rejoinder, disproves this. So the negative disproves the necessity of the proposed change by demonstrating either the superiority of the status quo or demonstrating that the affirmative's proposed change lacks uniqueness, right? So what I mean by the affirmative's change lacks uniqueness is that a competitive option can generate uniqueness for something that does not require the plan in order to solve the affirmative's advantages. And in a policy debate, the proposed change takes the form of a proposed policy solution. The negative can then rejoin that by demonstrating that the proposed policy solution is not unique to the advantages that it's trying to solve, or demonstrating that we should simply do nothing and that the status quo would be better. Critique debates, though, work really differently, and to illustrate this, I'm just going to give some examples of things that might happen in a policy round, and we can figure out whether or not these meet the burden of proof, burden of rejoinder. So example one, let's say that the affirmative says we should strengthen IP in the area of pharma innovation. They then read a bunch of cards, just a bunch of impact cards about nuclear proliferation with no connection drawn whatsoever between the plan and nuclear proliferation. It's just kind of randomly there. If the negative says nuclear proliferation is good, have they rejoined the plan? Have they disproven the plan? Anyone? Thoughts? No? Yes?
If both sides treat the internal link as true, then kind of. I mean,
So maybe if both sides agree the internal link is true. But let's say hypothetically there's a nuclear prolif impact that is just randomly in the 1AC that got copied over by mistake. The neg impact turns it, and then the AF is like, the neg is not, we have not made an argument that nuclear proliferation has anything to do with the plan. The neg has not read any link cards or internal link cards, so we're not answering this. In this scenario, I think we could probably agree that that impact turn does not dispute the plan, right? And if you think about it, a lot of critiques operate in a very similar fashion. Critiques often identify a component of the 1AC that is missing or not there, and then attempt to leverage offense predicated on that. If we are debating under the assumption that the burden of proof merely requires that the affirmative demonstrates that their proposed change has uniqueness, then none of those link arguments would be applicable. They would all be nothing, right? So if the affirmative makes a bunch of arguments about nuclear proliferation, the negative says arguments about nuclear proliferation are part of liberal ideology is bad, then the AF under a normal framework argument would not be required to answer this, because it does not disprove that the plan is a good idea. It disproves some other thing that may be tangentially related to the plan, but does not demonstrate the plan is a bad idea. The solution to this problem for the neg is framework. So framework is designed to resolve the fundamental problem that critiques have, which is that critiques do not meet the burden of rejoinder. The issue is the burden of rejoinder itself. So what if we could advance arguments that change what the burden of rejoinder is? This would also change the burden of proof. The role of the negative under a critique might be to disprove the necessity of the plan to solve its harms. The role of the negative should be expanded. and the nature and scope of this and how we change this can be really complicated, and generally ends up being very much like a topicality debate. So, do you have a question?
Yeah, when you say that critiques do not meet the burden of rejoinder, can you kind of talk about that? Like,
Yeah, so critiques do not disprove that the plan is a good idea. So the affirmative says, plan, do a thing. They say we should do this thing to solve a series of impacts.
right.
Critiques do not disprove that the plan is a good idea. Critiques say that the ideology of the plan is bad, or the philosophy of the plan is bad, or the ethical implications of the plan's idea are bad, but they do not disprove that the plan is what is necessary to solve the impact, or that the plan solves the impact. Some critiques may do this, right? Those are really different, I think, and are much more like counterplan DA than critique. So to me, critiques are arguments that don't disprove the plan. So they're disadvantages that do not have uniqueness because they're about something that is happening in the status quo. So for example, if we were to take up like the international relations critique, the affirmative is like change IPR because it's necessary to win the tech race with China. And you read a link argument that says viewing China as a threat is bad.
Right.
Viewing China as a threat is bad does not disprove the plan. It is instead an argument about something the 1AC has said that is not the plan, which is why they do not meet the burden of rejoinder.
All right.
Because they don't rejoin the proposed change. They identify some other thing that is not the proposed change and then rejoin that.
Okay. That makes sense.
Yeah. So in order to solve this problem, with critiques don't meet the burden of rejoinder, the negative needs a framework interpretation. And that framework interpretation changes the scope of competition and changes what constitutes a link from just being yes, no action of plan to being about some other thing. And the way that you get to that is generally pretty arbitrary, at least to some extent. So I think that the neg will often try to justify these arbitrary interpretations by describing a limited set of circumstances under which they're allowed to expand the burden of rejoinder. But all of those expansions, by definition, then also expand proof. So the number of things the affirmative becomes responsible for defending enormously expands. So in a typical policy debate, the AF has to defend that the plan is a good idea. In a debate where the negative changes rejoinder to say that we could rejoin any aspect of the plan's idea or ideology, the affirmative is now responsible for defending each word choice in the 1AC. So let's say your 1AC, you're reading like 400 words per minute, you have 8 minutes, none of you are 400 words per minute. Let's say 300 words per minute, you have 2,400 words, you have to have a defense of each of those 2,400 words. Now let's say that the 1AC itself is 10,000 words if you look at the ununderlined part. You also have to be responsible for each of those 10,000 words. So that's 10,000 critiques that you now need a 2AC block to, potentially or hypothetically. You also are responsible for any ideology that the 1AC imports. So if you have an ideology of liberalism that undergirds your IR advantage, you are now responsible for not just defending the plan, but also defending all of liberalism. Oftentimes it can feel like when you're debating a critique, you are responsible for defending the past, the present, and the future. You're responsible for debating all of the previous bad things that your ideology did. You're responsible for defending the status quo. You're responsible for defending the implications of the plan. You're responsible for defending the implications of your ideology being implemented. And it can feel like pretty overwhelming in terms of 2AC strategy and 2AC preparation. So the solution to this problem for the AF is also framework. And the most common interpretation is typically something along the lines of the affirmative gets to weigh the consequences of the plan against a competitive alternative, something like this. And this is the logical equivalent of framework no case. Or plan focus is kind of what it is, but in many ways, this is framework no case. That case should not be allowed. Alright, so what do I mean by this? If it is the case that the negatives critique must compete based solely on the plan, then what you're saying is the neg gets counterplan DA. They do not get to critique the underlying assumptions or philosophy or rhetorical choices. And this can sometimes be extremely helpful, right? So for many judges, for many people, the best way to deal with critiques is to read an interpretation like this. The debate is extremely clean and straightforward. Typically, if the AF wins framework, the AF wins. If the neg wins framework, the neg wins. The neg will usually win framework if the AF drops a thing. I think if evenly debated, the AF basically wins 100% of the time. If the affirmative answers all of the neg's arguments and doesn't drop tricks, then usually the AF will win, because it is, I think most people are on board with critiques make it pretty hard to be affirmative. However, it also can make doing prefs really difficult, because there are many judges, including a lot of more middle-of-the-road judges these days, who are pretty hostile to the notion critique should not exist. And so what you're debating is not the negative, like your interpretation versus the neg's interpretation. Smart negative teams will essentially make the debate just solely a referendum on whether K's should exist at all. And if they win that the conclusion of your interpretation is that K's can't exist, then they don't have to win that their interpretation is good. They just have to win that the existence of critiques is good. And that is a much harder argument to beat than the whatever like the neg's interpretation is. And so that's kind of a basic overview of framework debating and how it exists now. Does anyone have more further questions about this part? Yeah.
Can you talk like a little bit more on how on ACT to defend the interpretation that you shared, like while also defending that K's in general in debate are good?
So how does the AF defend? Well, so the AF would just say that you get critiques, they just need to have alternatives that, resolve a net benefit that is a DA to the plan, right? So the negative has to win that the plan uniquely causes a bad thing, because you have said that the debate should be centered on the consequences of the plan, right? Our interpretation is plan focused. And so the neg gets critiques, they just have to win links to the plan. Right, so they need to win, for example, that strengthening IP props up capitalism in some unique form or fashion, and then they need to win an alternative that competes with that and also solves. The problem that you run into is that it is very, very difficult to identify an alternative that can solve capitalism or solve racism or solve sexism that is not enormous and extremely permutable. So if you're only stuck with critiques that force you to have both a reason that the affirmative's change is bad and also an alternative that can resolve not just that change but also the origin of the ideology that you're criticizing, then it can be extremely difficult to beat the permutation. And you're essentially just reading a less strategic version of like ban IP plus patents bad. Yeah.
I guess why don't more KT, like people on neg that read K's, read just the link, the impact to the link, and then all that solves that very specific impact. Like why is it so common that like most K's have like capitalism causes extinction, and then they're all is either very commutable or like very small and doesn't solve?
Well, so I think that you kind of answered your own question in a way. So I feel like if the neg said link just very, very specific to IP, and then an impact to just that link, and then an alternative that just resolved that link, it kind of feels like that would be an extremely small, and it would also probably have a lot of uniqueness problems. So you're kind of just describing like the ban IP counterplan. So like I think that exists. It's just that's just a uniqueness counterplan in a DA. So like people do read that. It's just the strategic value of critiques is that they allow you to criticize the affirmative for reasons that are not just solely focused on the plan. And so if you're going to read an argument that is just solely focused on the plan, you could call it a critique, you could call it a counterplan, you could call it whatever you want, but you're not really criticizing the AF's assumptions. You're just going for a uniqueness counterplan in a DA. And maybe that uniqueness counterplan resolves some issues, maybe it doesn't. But then now you're like, I don't know, like, does that make sense?
Yeah.
So like, yeah, I think people do this all the time. It's just not really a critique at that point, I don't think, because I think, to me, the definition of a critique is one that challenges the traditional burden of proof and burden of rejoinder that usually applies to policy debates.
So you're saying like in an instance where that's the case, you wouldn't be able to have any framework links?
Well, right, because you haven't disagreed about what the framework should be. So the NAG has agreed that the question of the debate is whether the plan is a good idea. They have read a critique alternative that provides uniqueness for a DA to the implementation of the plan. The debate is then a comparison between the world of the plan versus the world of the uniqueness counter plan that avoids the net benefit that's a DA to the plan. You're just having a policy debate. Even if someone calls it a K, like it's not, it's just, you're just having a policy debate at that point. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And those happen constantly. Like those are very, very common. You probably have many of them every year.
In KVK debates, the interpretation that you like gave to us, is that kind of similar to what chaos will go for, or will it be a lot more like epistemic or like kind of like method based?
Yeah, so KVK debates competition is really difficult to figure out.
Okay.
Extremely hard to figure out. So because it is definitely, to continue the theme of the IP camp, it is a case by case basis. Every KF is so different. KFs by their nature are just like, there are no limits to them. There's no way to predict what they will be in advance. They could be literally anything. So an affirmative where the 1AC just read poetry would maybe have a different framework argument than a 1AC that was like, putting a pile of VATS cards and then not reading a plan. They probably would have like very different approaches to how to debate framework. No, it's not shade, it's fine. It's just like, a lot of KFs on this topic will just be like literally that. They'll just like they're just gonna take their like critique 1NC, read it in the 1AC and call it an F. So when you say competition in K debates, if generally the way that they happen is that the affirmative is either about a structure or it's not about a structure, and then the critique that the NAG goes for is often a structural criticism like capitalism or anti-blackness or settler colonialism, or it's a non-structural criticism. And then the framework arguments are basically, once again, what constitutes a link. So framework is about what does it mean to disprove the plan? Like what does the negative need to do to disprove the affirmative? Right? So normally it is disprove the plan is a good idea. In a K versus policy debate, the NAG is saying we should be able to disprove some other thing in addition to the plan. So the most common interpretation is like the affirmative is an object of study, or the affirmative is a research project, or the affirmative is an 8-minute essay. We should be able to disprove the justifications or epistemology or the ontology or whatever, the ethics that informs that essay or that research project. And so you are making arguments about why the burden of rejoinder should be expanded and changed beyond just the plan. And typically the expansion that you've identified lines up with your link arguments. So when you're choosing what your neg interpretation should be, you want to make sure that your interpretation includes your links. And you also often want to have an interpretation that includes your links, but not all that much more. Because then you can make arguments about why your interpretation is fair and justified or whatever, because it does create some limits on what the negative can do. So hopefully that kind of that makes sense for that one. For KVK debates, it's kind of the same. The affirmative will, for example, just describe a bunch of reasons why the world is messed up. And then the negative is like, okay, we agree the world is a bad place. How do we disprove what you've said? They need link arguments. If the negative just made a bunch of arguments that were like, we agree the world is messed up, but we think it's messed up for different reasons, that doesn't disprove that the affirmative's reasons. So if the 1AC was colonialism is really bad, here's a pile of cards, we should do a thing to solve colonialism. and the neg said capitalism is actually really bad, we should try to stop capitalism, that doesn't disprove the F. And so the negative needs to identify a framework interpretation that makes a condition for what it looks like to disprove the affirmative. And that is what the framework debates are about. But each one of those, those interpretations vary as much as K of Fs do. And so, that is why it's a little bit difficult to know in advance what that question is. But I think framework debating is really, really important in KVK debates because you need to identify for your judges what the scope of competition is, what it looks like to disprove the AF, or what it looks like to prove that the AF is a good idea. And so both sides should have some interpretation of what each side's win condition looks like, right? Like framework is kind of trying to identify the scope of competition, but also what the win condition is for each side. There should be one for both sides. So a good framework interpretation will have an explanation for what it looks like for the AF to win, what it looks like for the neg to win. It should be clear and concise. There should be reasons that it's predictable and good. There should be offensive justifications for your interpretation from your literature base. And then there should be arguments about why it's fair. And that is kind of what makes up a good framework interpretation.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Do you think no perms and KVK debates is a real argument, and how do you win it on the negative?
Do I think it's a real argument in the sense that people say it? I think that there are some good. I think that there are some good justifications for it to some extent, but it's also not debated very well. So this argument, no perms in a K debate or no perms in a method debate, is usually what people say, is like if the affirmative is not topical, they should forego their rights to a permutation. And the reason for this is kind of logical. So permutation, what is a permutation? What is a legitimate permutation? Yeah?
All of the plan, some or all of the counterplan.
Yeah, so all of the plan plus some or all of the competitive option. If the plan is not there, then perm should error 404, like did not find, like you get the like error message because there was no plan to compare to the counterplan or to compare to the alternative. And if it's the case that there was no basis for competition, that it is a text, there's no text for which the negative can base competition that outlines the mandates and text of the proposed change, then there's no basis for the neg to compete. And so it makes no sense to say that an argument isn't competitive because there's no basis for a judge to determine whether or not it is or isn't competitive. And so the no perms in the method debate argument is just like if there's no proposed change, the neg should just be able to say whatever it wants. And the judge just compares whatever the AF said with whatever the neg said. The problem with this is that ultimately comparisons exist, like comparisons happen. And so the thing you have to figure out when you're debating a KF and you're trying to go for a critique is what is the reason that the AF thinks they should win? So a lot of people start off this like cross-X question, why vote AF? It's like a little broad. I'd recommend some much more specific questions about that. So I think that a really good way of doing it is basically identifying things that the AF has impacts about and then asking how voting AF solves that impact. So for example, if there is like a colonialism impact, you could ask how is it that how does voting affirmative solve this impact? They will either not have an answer, and so you could kind of take advantage of this because now they've introduced an impact that they don't have a good explanation for how they solve, which could be very helpful. Or there is some sort of answer, and that answer is some type of action. It might not be a material action, it might be an idea, or a philosophy, or an ethic, or whatever. But whatever their answer to how do we resolve this harm, that becomes a basis for how we would compete. And so you can make arguments that we can compete based on that explanation, either by impact turning it, or having some alternative mechanism for resolving it, and the net benefits to that would be your criticism of the AF's method or idea or ethic. And that's kind of a way of figuring out what the AF does. But a lot of times, the 1ACE will be very, very unclear for what change it is proposing or what idea it is proposing. And in those cases, the neg can advance arguments that a permutation is illogical because it is impossible for the affirmative to say neg arg doesn't compete with our proposed change because they have not proposed a change for the neg to compete on in the first place. And so the only way to then resolve those debates is to simply compare methods in the abstract. I kind of think this argument is much more useful though as an explanation for why T is true, because the debates that occur over a hypothetical affirmative that doesn't propose a change are inevitably, they lack comparison. And so any of the benefits we might get from clash or advocacy or whatever just don't occur in those ones because the affirmative proposes a thing about one thing, the neg says something totally unrelated, the judge just decides the debate based on who's a better speaker, or who they're more excited about to listen to that day. It's very arbitrary, it's very hard to decide how to adjudicate a winner or a loser if there's no basis for competition. Yeah.
So does it become a question of substance, i.e. AF says this is the methodology, we do a decolonial movement?
So you've proposed a change.
Right.
So in that case, if you said we do a decolonial movement that solves colonization, the basis the neg has to compete is by disproving the uniqueness of a decolonial movement.
Right. Let's say it's more epistemic, i.e. a critical black analysis.
Okay.
Neg stands up and says cap K. AF stands up and says perm because decolonial or black critical analysis is a priori to any capitalist movement, i.e. CRC goes down the list.
Okay.
Why is that not competitive? Why is not comparing substantive instances of methodologies not seen as competitive, or is it?
So I think that the example you're giving, if it is the affirmative endorses, what did you say? You said
a critical black analysis.
Critical black analysis, and then that solves a harm.
Yes.
Yeah. So you are identifying, you are establishing a win condition for yourself.
Okay.
So the win condition you're establishing is if we win, that our method is necessary to solve a harm, then you should vote affirmative. The negative then has the burden of rejoinder. So their rejoinder that they have to meet, assuming they've accepted these terms, is they have to disprove that analysis is necessary to solve that harm. Or they have to identify some competitive method that solves a harm that is more important. And if you win that their method is not competitive, then they have not met the burden of rejoinder because they have not disproved that black critical analysis is necessary to solve the harm you've identified.
Okay.
And so you would win that debate.
Okay.
The no perms in a method debate thing kind of falls apart pretty quickly in the case where the neg has agreed to the AF's terms. So in order for no perms in a method debate to make sense to me, you either need to win that there is no change the affirmative has endorsed with a causal harm that it solves, so there's no basis for you to rejoin the plan, so there's no basis for competition, or you need to win that the negative burden of rejoinder should be different, right? So the most common way of doing this is the negative should not be burdened with rejoinder against non-topical affirmatives. And so I kind of think that the argument that, so one thing that I think it does make sense to me, the best use of this, I think, is when the 1NC reads a counterplan or a critique and says no perms in a method debate, or the AF should forgo the right to a permutation if it's not topical, and has a series of arguments. And then the AF has to then answer those arguments in the 2AC, and you could use their answers to demonstrate kind of the arbitrariness of shifting the burden of rejoinder away from the topic. Because it means that a lot of times the way these debates end up working is that the entire debate is just a framework debate over whether or not the negative strategy competes and the basis for competition is like really, really obvious if the neg wins framework, and there's no basis for competition if the AF wins framework. So whether you have a planless AF versus T or planless AF versus K, you're just having a framework debate. Like it's just a framework debate either way, because it's it is all a question of what constitutes disproving the AF. And a lot of critical AFs, it is very difficult to figure out what constitutes disproving the AF or what the role of the negative should be.
What is the best way to describe, like what you were saying, that it's unclear what the AF wants the negative to rejoin? Like, because the common way people say it is like, the AF gets like shifty or whatever, but I feel like that's not really the best way to
Yeah, I wouldn't describe it as like K debaters tend to be shifty, because now you've just like gotten yourself into like an ism debate or whatever. Instead, I think that it is just that in a debate with a plan, it is extremely clear both functionally and textually what the basis for competition is, right? So there's a proposal that you've said an actor should do. That proposal has a series of mandates. The neg can compete on those mandates. Those mandates are clear from the beginning, at least to some extent. And they're also predictable because their origin is in the topic, and so they can be predicted in advance. A lot of times the affirmative, it is very unclear what their mandates are, particularly if those mandates do not endorse some material change. So that's why it's very case by case, because I think that this no perms in a method debate argument is pretty bad if the AF is like redefine the USFG to mean the people and say like the people should form intellectual commons to strengthen copyright over certain forms of music. It's like, well, like it's not topical, but the basis for competition is extremely clear. And so the argument you should go for is not basis for competition is unclear. You should go for the basis of competition was unpredictable, i.e. topicality. But a lot of times the affirmative is totally, it does not have an advocacy statement that clearly outlines a mandate. And so I think no perms in a method debate has become kind of this like insert meme against every single KF when it's not always appropriate. But I think it is appropriate if the affirmative does not have an advocacy that identifies specific mandates. Because if there is no mandate, then there is no basis for you to compete. And so a permutation doesn't make sense. So in an affirmative that has an advocacy statement that isn't topical, a legitimate permutation might be all of the advocacy plus some or all of the negatives counter advocacy. And that language makes a whole lot of sense. It does not make sense if there is no advocacy that has a mandate. And that is where no perms in a method debate, I think, does actually make a whole lot of sense, at least to me. The other part of this question is how do you know what the mandate is, I think, and if it is not clear, you have to ask in CX, and if it is unclear in CX, then it is probably it is not like they can be shifty or they could be shifty. It is like they have not identified a basis for which we can compete, which means that there is no role for negation, right? So in order for the negative to have a role, like the negative's role is burden of rejoinder. If there is nothing for us to rejoin, right, there's no mandate for us to rejoin, then the negative has no role. So there's no point in us disagreeing with the affirmative because there's no basis upon which we can disagree. Any other questions about this? Okay. Yeah.
How do you know when it's best to include, like to establish a competition framework argument? Is it when it's better to include a counterplan to do that versus a criticism?
That's a good question. So, I think that I think that it depends what your argument is. So I think that a lot of times doing both can be really useful. So if you're trying to demonstrate that that the affirmative has a mandate that is mutually exclusive with topical action, then the affirmative reading a counterplan to do some sort of topical action can be really useful. So if the 1AC is like 8 minutes of cards that IP is racist, the 1NC reading a counterplan to strengthen IP can demonstrate that the basis for competition is arbitrary if the affirmative then permutes that, because there's no legitimate basis for that permutation because they've severed out of their supposed mandate. And if they're like, it's not severance because we haven't mandated an action, then I think that demonstrates why they should forego the rights to a permutation because there's no basis for which you could have competed on because they've simply not endorsed a thing. For critiques, I think that in the most common example where critiques can be really useful is testing whether or not the affirmative endorses a material change. So a lot of times the AF will just be about debate, for example, and say what matters is in here instead of out there, or we should do some interpersonal stuff. If the negative says cap K, we need to engage the state and organize in order to survive the death of modernity and liberalism, then that could also be a really good test for competition as well. Basically, whether or not the affirmative thinks that we need to accomplish something in addition to whatever is going on here. Ideally, you could figure all this out in CX, but it can be really difficult to do. Like the best CX strategy for this generally is like you're asking what the AF does. They talk about a bunch of stuff that is in here and epistemology and ethics and thoughts. And you're like, all right, well, you've got this climate change impact. What about voting affirmative resolves climate change? And they'll either make arguments about why their affirmative is a prerequisite to material change, in which case you now have a thing you can impact turn, which is the notion that individual ethics should come before material changes, and that is very good for something like the CAPK, or even just like a federal government, like fiat a carbon tax or whatever. Or they make arguments about spillover, and now you've got a thing that you can compete on because you can disagree with their spillover. And so that's why asking about stuff in relation to impacts can be really, really helpful.
The stuff about reading a topical counterplan, like increase IPR.
Yeah.
What's the point of doing that? Like, or would you just read a bunch of impact trend saying IPR good?
Yeah, so for example, you could say USFG should strengthen IPR. Strengthening IPR is key to win the tech race, creating pile.
So just read.
And if the AF is like perm do both with their IPR is racist in all instances 1AC, then it is pretty clear that there is no basis for negation because you have impact turned the AF and they have still said permutation. If the affirmative's thesis about how framework should work and how competition should work allows the affirmative to sever, then that is a pretty unfair model of debate and makes it pretty hard to identify what the role of negation should be.
Topical advantage counterplan. Side eye, man. Okay, so AF, let's say, critiques the way that the police has functioned, also critiques how like that policing itself is like in debate in like certain ways outside of like formal form of police, whatever. Topical advantage counterplan, defund the police. I'm being real right now. Is it just giving like no, that does not solve, or the AF to no, that doesn't actually like how do you go about just saying no? Because I don't think you have to perm it at all in my head. Like I know you don't, and like I know like the non-debate way to be like no. But like, how do you say no?
Well, so you take the non-debate way of saying no, and then you say it in the 2AC. so if you say legal solutions to a problem fail for XYZ reasons, and the neg is like, what if we took a legal solution to solve the problem? Your 2AC should be like, hey, so we've impact turned this idea for 8 minutes. Here are the reasons why this is bad. Then you just have a debate, right? So now there's a basis for competition. The affirmative says we should not engage in legal strategies, we should do some other thing. That creates a clear basis for rejoinder. There's a clear, stable basis for competition. The neg can disagree that we should forego legal strategies and instead endorse them. And then we can have a debate over whether legal strategies are good or bad for resolving the AF's harm.
Right.
And we could also have a debate over whether there are other hypothetical net benefits to endorsing legal strategies that compete with the AF because the AF has said legal strategies are bad.
Right.
And so if you say permutation do both, that permutation certainly severs. If you're like, the perm doesn't sever because we didn't read a plan, what are you talking about? Then that answer belies this broader question of like, well, what is negation then? Like, why do you get a permutation? Like, if you could just sever things whenever you want to, then what is the role for the neg? And then no perms in a method debate makes sense.
Right.
But I kind of think that until the affirmative makes an argument that they can sever or they can add things to the, they can add stuff that is neither in the advocacy nor counter advocacy because they haven't actually read an advocacy. Until that happens, no perms in a method debate is not that important. But when that happens, I think then you go for this model of competition leaves out any role for negation. Okay. All right. So I want to return just for the last few minutes about Plan VK once again because that was kind of the thing I was set up to talk about. No, it's okay. You're good. You're good. That was very interesting. I learned some stuff too. I appreciate it. Those questions were very good from everyone. So hypothetically, I think that it is worth investigating a strategy for answering critiques that does not rely on plan focus. You should go for plan focus in front of judges who you know are just assessing the debate technically or already believe in plan focus. I think you should not go for plan focus in front of many people who do not. And it also allows your prefs to be a lot easier to do if you can include judges who are bad for plan focus and you have some other solution. The solution that I think you could try out is something called thinking of the debate as competing imaginaries or competing ideologies or competing ideas. So this is particularized to answer the framework interpretation of neg as that the neg is, or the affirmative is a research object, or the affirmative is an object of study or whatever. And given that the negative has made arguments that the debate should not be centered on the plan, the normal rules for what constitutes a legitimate permutation no longer apply. So a legitimate permutation under plan focus, all of plan, some or all of counterplan, yes? If the debate is not about plan focus, if the focus of the debate, if the scope of competition is some other thing, then permutations that would otherwise be intrinsic are no longer intrinsic. So if the neg says the neg gets to disprove, the AF is an object of study, we get to disprove justifications that are intrinsic to the plan, that's fair because you chose those justifications, then any permutation that is legitimate would include all of the affirmative justifications plus some or all of the negatives counter advocacy. And some or all of your justifications includes lots and lots of things that are not the plan. So to return to this example of AF v liberalism K, if the affirmative justification is liberalism and the basis for competition according to the neg is liberalism, then any liberal solution to the neg's impact is a legitimate test of the neg's alternative. So again, I'll say any solution that liberalism might have is now a legitimate test of the alternative. So if the neg is saying liberal solutions to IP bad, and then saying liberalism causes expropriation of labor in the global south, obviously the liberal solution to the expropriation of labor in the global south is not the plan, it's some other thing. The neg has said we should have a debate over liberalism good bad, not plan good bad, which means anything that liberalism might endorse as a solution to the neg's impact becomes a legitimate grounds for a permutation. And the way we can think about it is kind of more like a topicality debate than a counterplan DA debate. So the neg has said it's not counterplan DA, it's T. Their interpretation is justifications, and therefore there is kind of two, you imagine a case list. There is a case list that includes all of the stuff in the app's justifications. Anything in that bucket is a test of competition. And anything in the neg bucket, their alternative, let's say their alternative is like, like authoritarianism or something like that, or their alternative is communism. The neg, all of the time, will be like, communism solves the app impact. Communism lets us get to space better, or communism results in single payer. Single payer solves your drug prices advantage. Or communism would include the following set of Pigouvian taxes to solve climate change, right? So the neg does this all the time. The neg is like, alt solves the case and then spams a bunch of things that are consistent with their ideology. The app should obviously get to reciprocally spam anything that is consistent with their ideology in order to solve those impacts. And then the debate becomes basically like a case list of all of the stuff in your ideology versus all of the stuff in the neg's ideology. And if the neg is like, this permutation is intrinsic, then you could say, what's the basis for that? And they'll say, well, it does more than the plan or the alternative. And you're like, interesting. So plan is the focus of the debate. We will agree to that. And then, I think CX will go very, very poorly for the negative most of the time, because it is very difficult to explain why a permutation that endorses something consistent with the ideology they've criticized is intrinsic without resorting to the language of plan focus. And in order for the perm to be intrinsic, the scope of competition must be the plan. But they have said scope of competition is not the plan, it's this other thing, which means we now assess whether a permutation is intrinsic on the other thing, not on the basis of the plan. Yeah?
Does that kind of go back to the other question about, like, why don't Ks just, like, have one specific, like, impact to the, like, alt solves? Like, under a world where the plan, like, where you cannot have intrinsic perms in K debates, like, the only Ks that would exist would just be alts that solve only the impact to the link, and not anything broader.
Right, but the neg wants to have their cake and eat it too. Like, the neg wants plan focus to apply to the AF's competition arguments, but not for their competition arguments, which is completely illogical. It makes no sense that they could have it one way for the AF and another way for the neg. And so this framework argument can be really useful if you're reading an affirmative with an ideology that you are extremely prepared to defend. So I think that a lot of people make a pretty significant strategic error when they're writing their AF versus K teams, where, like, last year on the policy topic, a lot of people would read, like, job guarantee is good for modern monetary theory reason, and then read, like, some Valaden cards about why this disputes the ontology of money and interacts with colonialism in some way, which answers your K. But then the 2AC is still, like, plan focus. Well, now all of the ontology of money stuff that is an ideology you've been preparing to defend is no longer strategically very useful, and you're also just having a debate over whether Ks should exist. So I think that if you're writing an affirmative that you're trying to read against a team who's likely to go for a critique, it is suboptimal to say framework no Ks. Conversely, if you're reading an affirmative that you read against anyone, like if you read the same AF against every single team, you have no interest in defending the ideology of the AF, you just want to, have extinction outweighs debating, then you should say plan focus. The point of this lecture is not plan focus is a bad strategy. It's just that, one, there are alternative strategies, and two, plan focus plus AF designed for K team doesn't make sense together. I think this competing imaginaries idea much more sensical as a solution to this problem. we kind of also, like, we already do this a lot in CAP debates. So a lot of times CAP-K debates are pile of reasons that socialism solves stuff, and then pile of reasons that capitalism solves stuff. And because usually the alternative is explained in a pretty material way, like most of these debates are like 1NC, AF is capitalist ideology, capitalism causes extinction because of climate change, alternative to solve capitalism. The 2AC is plan focus, capitalism is good, link defense, alternative fails. The 2NC then says, we'll concede that you get to weigh the plan, but we get to weigh our links against the plan. Here's 10 cards about why cap's unsustainable and causes extinction. And then the AF goes for capitalism is actually really good. And basically this model of competing imaginaries is essentially what happens in that debate. The question is, how does that occur in debates where the negative does contest framework? What does that look like? And I think that even in debates where the negative does contest framework, you could still have the exact same structure that you would in a CAP-K debate, where you just have a bunch of defenses of the ideology that's been criticized, and you just go for like, liberalism is good for a bunch of reasons. You have said that the debate is not about whether the plan is good, it's about whether liberalism is good. If we win liberalism is good for a reason, it doesn't matter whether it's tied to the plan. We should be able to go for it as an impact turn to the alternative because you've said it's competitive as per your own framework interpretation. Yeah.
How does that go about like in terms of like weighing the impacts of the app? So like a good example would be like, I don't know, like secular stagnation or something like that. Like that's not defending like all of capitalism or whatever. But if the negative contests framework, could you still say like secular stagnation causes extinction or whatever, plan is the only way to solve that as like a reason why capitalism is good? Or does that
So yeah, so like so in a CAP-K debate, it is often strategic to concede the link and then make arguments that means that if the plan is like, if the plan is an example of capitalism and you win that only the plan is capable of solving an impact, then that is an argument for why capitalism is good, because only a capitalist solution is capable of solving this problem, which is an existential risk. Is that what you're asking?
Yeah, I mean it does help. I guess another thing is like if they win that like the plan is not the focus, like how exactly does like that's something I get confused about, which is like if you say like plan is the only way to solve this, but if they win that like the plan is not the focus of the debate or whatever, then like how exactly does that like work?
Well, right. So if the neg wins, that the focus of the debate is the philosophy that undergirds the AF versus the neg, the plan is an example of that philosophy, and so you need to win that you can't separate philosophies from their real world applications, and we should assess the implication of applying a philosophy to a real world situation. The plan is an example of applying capitalist philosophy to solve a problem. If the neg drops that application solves an existential risk, then it is an argument for why capitalism solves existential risks that the alternative can't access.
Right. So like you can win that argument without like losing plan focus or whatever. Is that like?
Well, so I think so. Like so if the neg says philosophical competition, I think that you could win that whether or not the plan is the sole focus of the debate. If the plan is an example of your philosophy, you should be able to test that example versus the neg's examples.
Okay.
And what I was kind of trying to get at with the CAP-K thing and why this competing imaginary stuff is not that radical is most of the time CAP-K debates just are this. Like this is just how they work. You test a bunch of examples of the F's philosophy versus examples of the neg's philosophy, and usually because most teams feel pretty good about their cap good stuff, they don't go for framework no Ks against the CAP-K. Because you never would. You would be like, why would I go for framework no Ks against cap when I could just go for cap good, my cards are really good? My thing is like, imagine if that were true for most critiques. Like, imagine if you felt as good about your liberalism good pile, or your realism good pile, or your like, neolib good stuff as you did about your cap good stuff. And that's kind of the thesis of why I think this is potentially a good idea. And that is particularly true if you're taking the time to write an affirmative that you are planning to read against teams who tend to go one-off. If you did that and you did not vet every single card, every author, every idea, then the practice of writing that new affirmative is totally pointless. and you should just read your normal 1AC, which is a strategy that works really well for some people. Like it is totally fine and totally good if your game plan against teams who tend to say one-off critique is just to do your normal stuff because that's what you're best at. Highly encourage it. But I think a lot of people tend to try to do something different. And if you're going to do a different thing, you should take advantage of the different thing you're doing. Because otherwise, you're having the same debate, except you're less familiar with your stuff. So it's just basically, I think, if you say new AF with advantages that are designed to be more critical and plan focused, you're just doing a worse version of your previous AF.
If you're reading like your regular policy app versus a critique, and you know that they're going to make like an interpretation in 2MC that's like about competing imaginaries, do you think it's strategic, and you do have a defense of your ideology like in your app, do you think it's strategic to read this like the competing imaginaries interpretation in the 2AC, or if is just read your regular like weigh the consequences interpretation in the 2AC and then in the 1AR to like concede their interpretation? We have a
So I think there's a couple ways of going about it. There's a few ways of going about it, and I haven't seen enough debates to really know what I think is best.
Okay.
So the first way of going about it is to just say plan focus, and then make permutation arguments that are obviously intrinsic
Okay.
in a plan focus model. Then when the neg says object of research and then calls your permutations intrinsic, you could then be like, you could then CX them in the 2NC about why they think the perms are intrinsic. They'll say because they do things that are not part of the plan or the alternative. You'll then say that seems convenient. We do agree that the plan is the focus of the debate, and you could get them to kind of like demonstrate that there's severe tension between their answer to your permutation and their answers to your framework argument. And this can be really helpful in demonstrating why debates that are not focused on the plan are much worse. Because to be honest, like a model debate where the AF reads 10 or 15 random things liberalism could do, the neg reads 10 or 15 random reasons liberalism does that are bad, we don't debate the plan, not a very good model debate. And so you could use cross-ex to demonstrate that, and then ultimately the 2AR is still plan focused, but you could utilize that cross-ex to demonstrate the inherent tensions, inconsistency, and arbitrariness of their model, and how they want it to apply for them but not for you, or apply to you but not to them. The second is to just like do it in the 2AC if you're feeling really confident about it, and then maybe even read cards, like change your 2AC cards to assume that you are testing your imaginary versus their imaginary. But that would be a very different kind of 2AC where you're basically deciding that that is going to be the debate, and then your 2AR is probably permutation and not framework. So it depends whether so I think this is useful in either case basically. Like even if you want to go for plan focus, this is still really, really helpful because it forces a lot of difficult questions on the part of the neg. Yeah.
Can you give some examples of these intrinsic perms and or perm tests?
Yeah, so like let's say that the AF strengthens IP, the neg says strengthening IP is neoliberalism. Neoliberalism is bad because it causes climate change. The alternative is to reject neoliberalism. You could make a permutation argument that it is about a neoliberal solution to climate change. So maybe a neoliberal solution to climate change would be to give incentives to investors to invest in renewables or something like that. And so you could say do the plan and also incentivize renewable investment, and then read a card that says more investment in renewables solves climate change. And so that would be an example of a test that is legitimate under the neg's interpretation of proof rejoinder, but illegitimate under yours if you're saying plan focus, right? It would obviously violate plan focus because it would be clearly intrinsic. But if the neg has said that it's a question of competing ideologies, not a question of plan versus counterplan, then it is not intrinsic because it is part of your ideology. Does that answer your question?
Yeah.
Okay, well, I'll take a couple more, but we gotta wrap up because it's noon. Yes?
Yeah, just like quickly, something, I mean, this has kind of been explained to me before, but I just like it. So what part of, in the permutation what part includes the like negatives, like either political imaginary or whatever? Because like you're saying like we can use this neoliberal solution to climate change. I guess something I've always been like is like what part of the negatives, like ideologies that include?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So if the neg is like object of study, we get to disprove justifications. It is just a test of whether they've disproven the justifications. Right. So permutations in K-debates don't really make sense as such because you're like if the neg is like reject the AF, do some other thing. You're not really permuting the alternative per se because you're not saying do plan plus do socialism or do plan plus reject plus end the world or whatever. Suppose potentially if the neg is like alt end the world, you're permuting a component of ending the world because you're ending the world of energy incentives or whatever your perm is, but you're not really permuting the alt. And so the word permutation is kind of meaningless in most K debates. Really, it's just language that has been imported from counterplans and kind of like stapled on to critique debating in a way that usually makes no sense at all. But it is like the language that is most familiar to judges. And so the reason I'm using permutation is just because you're testing whether the negative has disproven the ideology, right? Because if your ideology can solve the harm that they've said it causes, then they have not disproven the ideology, so they have not met the burden of rejoinder, and their thing does not compete.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah, it's not a reason the app is a bad idea.
Sorry. I feel good.
Glad you feel good. Alrighty, well, thanks for coming. Go to lunch. See ya.